Welcome, everyone, for today's Rising Tide Foundation presentation, where I'm very, very happy to be joined by Tony Gosling, who has been recently. Tony fell onto my radar, and I picked up a book that Tony's recently written called The Traitors of Arnhem, Martin Bormann and the Bilderberg Group. Tony actually sent that to me. The 1944 Origins of 1954 Bilderberg Conferences, the Bormann-Bernhard-Carrington Timeline of Treachery. It is a fantastic read. It is short. It is dense. It is groundbreaking. And I asked Tony, and Tony's got an immense amount of experience in broadcast journalism, working at different times at the BBC, and has been just an investigative reporter with a good bearing on the flows and currents of history, with a good grasp of the various mystery cults, the Gnostic epistemological currents that have been running rampant, sabotaging many positive developments of the human experience for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so his ability to cut through a lot of misinformation when analyzing more current events, and here I'm talking about events of World War II as current, is really important. And so I asked Tony to do a presentation today. He was happy to oblige, and like usual, after Tony's formal presentation, we're gonna take a little bit of a 4 or 5 minute tea break, a little respite, an intermezzo, and then we'll circle back here for some interactive dialogue. And I ask everybody to leave your name in the chat box if you want to ask Tony a question, or raise your digital hand accordingly, and I'll call upon you as I always do. So, Tony, without further ado, the stage is all yours, my friend.
Well, a tea break's very appropriate because there was a song in World War II in the pop charts called "Everyone Stops for Tea," and it was all about how the British will always at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the guns fall silent and they all have a cup of tea. And in fact, this is featured in the film A Bridge Too Far with Robert Redford, when he turns his gun on to the British at the Bridge of Nijmegen, saying, "Get on up the road and go and help your paratroopers at Arnhem, the 1st Airborne Brigade Division, who were isolated and beleaguered there." And he screams at Lord Carrington, who was then a young man, captain in the Grenadier Guards, sitting in his tank, and he said, "You mean you're going to stop for tea?" Yeah. Anyway, they stopped actually for 12 hours, which was a crucial 12 hours in that battle in Arnhem in September 1944, which enabled the Germans to actually reinforce between Nijmegen and Arnhem, the last 2 bridges, the penultimate and the final Bridge Too Far, and lost them the battle. So this is at the heart, really, of my investigation into the Battle of Arnhem, which has been so well put together by Joseph E. Levine, I think in the late 1970s, in this long, epic war film, A Bridge Too Far. But anyway, to start at the beginning, I first came across the Bilderbergers probably 3 or 4 years after I'd left the BBC, or the BBC had eased me out of the way, I suppose is a better way of putting it. And the internet was just on the scene in the mid-1990s as a sort of, I saw it as my filing cabinet in a way. So if there was an investigation, which in the old days would have made it to air, maybe, most likely they did, back in the old days, these were there left for other people to see and possibly for me to build on. And I first came across these Bilderberg conferences in around about 1995, 1996, and was really shocked that so many powerful people should be going to these. And yet there's zero reporting of it in those days at all. In fact, even nowadays, very little. And particularly looking at the rather toxic mix of royalty, finance, I mean, really the top people in the Western world, the media owners, war people, so the War Party and the Intellectual Party, all in there. And all of it led by Henry Kissinger, David Rockefeller, these characters. It seemed to me to be a sort of think tank of sorts. But I discovered an article in one of the Christmas editions of the Observer magazine which is a City of London Rothschild organ nowadays, and it always did have a lot of influence from the Rothschilds, but certainly a City of London organ. It's what all of the people in the political parties in Britain read, so that they're seeing what they're supposed to think as they develop policies these days. And the article said "ne plus ultra," Bilderberg, and it turned out that the article had only got into the Observer, which means no more above this. Yeah, and it only got into the Observer because it had a relief editor over the Christmas week who had allowed someone to write something about the Bilderberg. Now, there is a whole history through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s of censorship, including a book even written by C. Gordon Tether, who was a columnist in the Financial Times, who had his work censored. So in a way, it was a sort of London journalists in story that wasn't allowed to be spoken about. C. Gordon Tether had several articles he'd written for his Lombard column, I think it was, in the Financial Times that had been spiked by the editors about Bilderberg, saying how these people have a tremendous amount of influence on the economy, and so we need to know about them. That people writing about the share prices, etc., need to take them into account. But you know what? The thing that really sparked my interest in digging into the Bilderbergers was living in Oxford in the 1990s. I had access to the Bodleian Library, which was a fantastic resource, and so I could go through on any topic I wanted to, and I did. Looked in particularly into the shutdown of public transport by the Rockefellers in the United States, and the similar thing that happened in Britain in the 1960s with Richard Beeching closing the railways, and eventually the privatisation of the buses, the trains, and everything by Thatcher and major governments. But the thing that really piqued my interest was getting hold of a book. I think it was the author was John Pomian, which was the biography of Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands. And I knew Bernhard had been the chairman of the Bilderberg conferences right from the very beginning in 1954 when they first convened. And in there it did say that, yes, he was a member of the SS. So I'm thinking to myself, not only is this something which is really almost like a taboo that journalists whisper about down the pub but don't dare write anything about, but also for the first 20 years of these meetings it was being chaired by a former SS officer, which is what Bernhard was. He was one of the first to join the SS when it was first formed, and then he renounced his Nazi leanings, allegedly, and he married into the Dutch royal family. So he was then amazingly trusted by the British during the Second World War, even though he'd been in the SS before the war, but not by the Americans. So the Americans would never, because everyone knew about what he'd done in the past, but for some reason the British allowed him to be a Dutch liaison officer during the war. So if you think about what was going on in Operation Market Garden, the Bridge Too Far, in 1944, this was a massive, supposedly anyway, liberation of Holland, which was the main liaison officer for it was a former SS officer. And he went on after the war, 10 years after that battle, to form this conference, which after 20 years he was relieved of his duties because of the Lockheed scandal. And so it was the link to the SS quite clearly in the driving seat of Bilderberg from the word go that got me interested. And around about 2000, I was approached. I put up a website at 96, I think it was, which was just lists really of who was at these Bilderberg meetings. You used to get these, well, you still do get these bizarre press releases which said on them, not for publication. And you think, well, what sort of press release is not for publication? The whole point of a press release is that you cut and paste it into the newspaper and off you go. So this is what you want to be in the newspaper. You might get a journalist just go through and alter a few things and token gestures, but the signal is to the editors and journalists with a Bilderberg old style press release is that you're not allowed to say anything about it. And you look at who's on the list, and it's all high security, blah, blah, leave it alone. And that's exactly what the London media did for many decades. There no articles about it. In fact, as I said, in the Financial Times, attempts to write about it were squashed. Yeah, the boot came down. And so this starts to become something much more sinister, much more interesting. And so, you talk a lot about, I know, about the occult and these secret societies, Matt. But do you know what? To me, it was just, this is where I ended up after just pursuing a very boring, normal political story, which is looking at how our policy is formed, how our politics is formed, how the direction of our society is, and whether or not our democracy is actually living up to the name in any way. And of course, looking at the Bilderberg over the years, it was quite clear that many of our leaders had been mysteriously appearing at a Bilderberg conference, either before they became an opposition leader and then the leader of the country, or else whilst their party was still in power. But they keep popping up, people like Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, there's a whole list of them, all appear at the Bilderberg before they come to public prominence and before they take over the leadership. And there was an immense amount of effort put into hiding, even from the Bilderberg lists, so removing their names from the list, people who were in these powerful positions. We've just had a Bilderberg conference, an emergency one, over in the United States in Washington, which was about 6 weeks earlier than usual this year because of probably of the Iran war, Trump's Iran war. And on the initial invite list is Mark Carney. So he's he's featured majorly in Bilderberg over the years, even on the steering committee, etc. So he's the sort of person you would expect to appear there. But on the official list this year, which they now put on their website, after pressure, I'm guessing, from me and my website putting these lists up every year, they have their own website now. And me and others, I'm not the only person that's been doing this. And he's not on the list. So, but the thing is, Matt, I know for a fact that Tony Blair went to the Bilderberg conference, one of the first I covered, because I spoke to the woman without any prompting who said, "Oh, I served Tony Blair his breakfast this morning." This was at the I think it was the Turnberry Hotel up in Scotland, but he's not on the list. So the Prime Minister of Britain at the time is at the conference, but his name is not on the list. So we have to understand there's an immense amount of deception, even being foisted on the press about who's at these Bilderberg conferences. Anyway, so I was approached in 2000 by Roger van Zwanenburg after putting up the Bilderberg.org website. Obviously, a lot of people knew about this, but they hadn't seen such a, I suppose, journalistic. I tried to be very fair about the way I reported them, factual and reference everything. And so Roger at Pluto Press approached me personally and said, "Look, Tony, it'd be really lovely to publish a book about this. Can you do us a book on the Bilderbergers?" And I thought about it for a few weeks, and then, or maybe even only about a week, and I called him back. I said, "Roger, no, I can't, because I just don't know enough about it. I've got quite a lot of information about how they started, who was involved, links to Freemasonry, this sort of thing, but I just don't feel I've got the full picture enough to write a book." And over the years, various people have come to me with bits and pieces of the jigsaw, Matt. So very important pieces of the jigsaw, including this link I was talking about to the Battle of Arnhem in September 1944, and the real utter, as I've now discovered, utter treachery of the British, senior British officers in the armed forces. That is to say, in the battle between the American paratroopers and the British Army, because the American paratroopers had cleared the way for the British Army in that battle to come all the way up in September 1944 from the southern part of Holland right up to Nijmegen. So many of the American 82nd Airborne, 101st Airborne had lost their lives clearing the way for these for the British tanks to come along. And when they got to Nijmegen, everything went wrong. The British General Browning diverted because he was in charge of it. They had a very young general in charge of the 82nd Airborne Division. And he was diverted by Browning to go up to the Groesbeek Heights out of the way. No, his job was to clear the bridge. He didn't really do that. But anyway, after another 12 or so hours of fighting, they did get to the bridge. They cleared the bridge, and as the British tanks rolled over the bridge, they then ground to a halt, as I was saying. And this is what I found so extraordinary about the entire battle, was this 12-hour pause, because if those carried on, those tanks would have actually made it to Arnhem, as we now know. And this is where I come to just running through some of the referenced information that I've come across over the years, which has explained all this to me. First of all, I have to mention a book. I'll run through the books now. So there's one book called Spycatcher. This is by Colonel Oreste Pinto. He was a Dutch-born British intelligence officer in World War II in the 1950s. He was all over the brand new television sets, black and white 405 line TV sets being transmitted around the country from the new BBC television studios, with his very popular series called Spycatcher, which has now been virtually disappeared. There are still the old books you can still buy in a Spycatcher omnibus, but his series of books after the war was really launched on the back of his intervention in Arnhem, in the Battle of Arnhem, at least his attempted intervention, because he realized that there was a Nazi Abwehr spy about to be sent into the Eindhoven region by the British. British supposedly thought he was a spy for them, but Pinto had realised, no, he's working for the Germans. And as he tried to stop this spy by the name of King Kong, and I won't go into all the details, but because it's a terrific tale. As he was about to stop him going, suddenly this guy is whisked away by, one would assume, Bernard and the High Command, because he's only a lowly colonel in the intelligence services, and he was taken into Eindhoven anyway, as he was just about to be arrested by Pinto. So this makes a great tale for his book, but more importantly, it shows you how the Germans really found out that this massive airborne operation in September 1944 was about to take place. So that's the first of the various reference books. Also must mention your favourite part of it, Matt, which is this August 1944 Red House meeting. Now, that was brought about, in fact, probably the best expose of that was done by, I believe, Paul Manning was a Canadian journalist. I'm not sure if he was Canadian or American, but he was working anyway for a CBS News radio in the United States with people like, wasn't his name Morrow, who was a very famous broadcaster in World War II, doing things like flying over in the daylight raids with the flying fortresses over Germany, bombing Germany, and bringing those reports back for the American public to hear. Actually very courageous, because he could easily have got shot down, as so many did. My uncle did, by the way. He was a Lancaster pilot. And so Paul Manning, what he did was expose this Red House meeting, explained that it was organised by Hitler's treasurer, Martin Bormann. But Bormann never actually went to the meeting. The idea was that this is all the German industrialists in Strasbourg getting together in August. So this is maybe 9 months before the eventual end of the war, to arrange what they called a flight capital scheme. So that's to get all of the German loot out of Germany, ready to recrudesce after the war, so that they could be reinvested in Germany and it could stay in the same corporate hands after the war. So basically, when the British and the Russians and the Americans arrive in Berlin, there's no loot anywhere, because it's all in places like Switzerland and Argentina and other South American countries, etc. So this meeting, this Red House meeting, was just before this operation, and I would suggest to you it had a lot to do with the British arrangement to make sure that they lost the Battle of Arnhem, because the reason for it simply was that the Germans needed more time to fulfill this Red House plan. And the war could most likely have been over by Christmas if that Arnhem mission had succeeded. A bridgehead over the Rhine at Arnhem would have meant panic in the German supply lines, panic on both the eastern and the western front, as the Germans had to move divisions, corps in order to protect the Ruhr and the industrial heartland of Germany, because of course they can't fight a war if they've lost that part of the country. But anyway, so I think that's the main reason why the British had to sabotage that battle, and Carrington and his senior officers didn't advance to Arnhem, didn't rescue the British soldiers, and didn't obtain that bridgehead. So the number of soldiers that died, roughly, I'm just referencing here, about 2,000 British servicemen of the 1st Airborne Division were killed and 7,000 captured. This was really the creme de la creme of the British Army, actually, at the time, and it was the ground forces of 30 Corps that let them die. Now, the reason we know this, so that book, by the way, the Paul Manning book, is Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, which talks about the Red House meeting. It talks about the whole arrangement. That was published in 1981. And really, it was his swan song. I remember reading that his publisher, I think it was his publisher, no, Manning's son was killed, and the publisher had their legs broken when that was published. Very, very worth having a copy and reading it, because it really explains how the Nazis from the Red House meeting had planned to get all this money after the war to create companies. In fact, Bormann was over in South America creating 750 companies into which he laundered much of the Nazi loot from the end of World War II, mostly from Switzerland, etc. Bormann was kept alive by the British, which I'll talk about in a second, and that was laundered through Sullivan and Cromwell's law firm, the Dulles Brothers law firm in New York, into these 750 companies. These companies were not allied to any individual nation. They were fascist international companies. They were multinational corporations. And the very smart thing that Bormann did was he put Jews in charge of the businesses, usually as a chairman. And many of the directors of these companies were basically, they're like a cult. They're a closed group of businesses. Were ex-SS supporters or even ex-SS officers. And so what you ended up with by the time Bormann had finished his dirty work by around about 1960 was you ended up with a Fourth Reich. Okay, it was only beginning. It was fairly small in comparison. They had $1 billion, mind you, to launder into them at the end of the war. And that Fourth Reich was a financial Fourth Reich. So the idea is, let's use banks, not tanks. Let's use businesses rather than bombs in order to take over. So, you don't have to blow something up. What you do is you have a hostile takeover. And this was supposed to be a very well organized, and I think has been a very well organized fascist international Fourth Reich. So maybe Bilderberg is related to this, but I'll talk a bit more about the connections. So Bormann is there over in South America doing all this stuff. There was another book which was written. Ladislas Farago did a book called Aftermath, which was where he published in a Saturday edition of the Daily Express in 1972. The headline: "Martin Bormann is alive." Right, and he'd got photographs of Bormann in his 70s, I think he was, in 1972 in Buenos Aires, that published in the Daily Express, because this guy was one of the war criminals from Nuremberg that had never been found and was said to have died. And as soon as that article appeared in the Daily Express, suddenly, they found Martin Bormann's remains in Berlin. It must be him, So, but what actually happened was, as we'll find out from the next book in the line, Op JB by Christopher Crichton, is that they'd sent a double in. They even had the guy's teeth altered to be identical to Bormann's, and he didn't realise what was going on, but he was shot in Berlin and left there to be a Bormann double and then to be found in the 1970s. But there is another twist, which is one of the how do you know, you might well ask, what are you talking about? The British were trying very hard, the Germans were just better than the British, and that's why they won the battle. No, if you read it, another book came out in 1994 by a British Army colonel, Robert Kershaw, and I mean, he's a fascinating chap who I spoke to and interviewed a few times. And his book is called It Never Snows in November, all about the Arnhem battle. And what he very cleverly done was track down some of the German generals after the war and interviewed them. He was a German speaker as well, and I interviewed him about what happened. And I think the guy's name was Heinz Harmel. He was the general in charge of the 10th SS Panzer Division, who were based around Arnhem. And he was adamant, look, if the British had just carried on at Nijmegen, we couldn't stop them. It would be all over for us, is his actual words. And so this is why this is so important, this confrontation between Robert Redford, who's actually playing a guy called Moffat T. Burris as a captain in the 82nd Airborne Division, who was threatening Carrington, who's sitting in his Grenadier Guard tank at the bridge at Nijmegen, saying, get on down the road. And that was really the key to if you want to understand why they didn't go, listen to the Germans. They said if they'd have carried on, it would have been. And when Harmel says it would have been all over for us, he's not just talking about that battle. He's talking about the bridgehead over the Rhine, isn't he? This was he couldn't believe his luck. That not only did when he saw that he was planning to blow the Nijmegen bridge up, and Moffat Burris with his paratroopers from the 82nd had just crossed the river, and they snipped the wires just before he tried to blow it up. That's what we now know. And I had the great privilege to interview Moffat Burris before he died, and he sticks to he's a fantastic. He's done his own book, by the way, called Strike and Hold. That came out in 2000. With some incredible exploits from the 82nd in the war. And so what we do is we then get to the situation where the 1st Airborne Division in September 1944 are isolated. So the Germans have come in because the British just waited for them to do it. And then they came in on this island between Arnhem and Nijmegen and blocked the advance, as the British allowed them to do, Carrington and his friends, who later became a chairman of Bilderberg and a secretary general of NATO, funnily enough. So they've left that piece of. They're isolated, totally isolated. So the British form a circle, and they're being pounded by these remains of these two still fairly strong SS Panzer divisions, who had been forewarned about the coming by Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands and King Kong, Christian Lindemans, the Abwehr agent, who the British had very kindly sent to tell them all about it. There was a lie, a leaked story, by the way. Oh, the Germans found the plans in a glider. Well, you don't put the plans in a glider. This is rubbish for a start. So this was the biggest airborne operation the world had ever seen at the time it happened. So the British are isolated. They're cut off completely. These paratroopers, and of course they don't have much in the way of heavy weapons. They had a few mortars. They had some artillery, a little bit of artillery, and some anti-tank guns. But they had no ammunition. The airdrops were dropping the ammunition in the wrong place, etc. And I was told by some of the residents in Oosterbeek, where I went to do a talk back in 2018. To a marvellous reception there in Oosterbeek. It was really lovely in the suburbs of Arnhem to talk about all this. The locals were fantastic, and they gave me a little tour around the place. But I was told that the British soldiers were drinking water out of the old rusty radiators. That's how bad things were getting there. Eventually, the British decided to do a night crossing and ferry themselves and swim back across the Rhine back onto the safe side. So it was not only a humiliation, but as I said, 2,000 dead and 7,000 captured. So then I start to realise a bit more about what was going on at that point with Bormann, because a book was published in 1998 96 called OpJB. by Christopher Crichton. And he was just dying basically in the late 90s, and I'm afraid I never got to meet him, but I did meet his wife. I had a long chat with her at his piano, which he played in his house in North London. Lovely to meet her, and his book explains the abduction of Bormann by the British with a small contingent of Jewish canoeists, commandos basically, from Berlin, right under the noses of the Russians, and they were sent in. Ian Fleming was there with naval intelligence. They were brought in right at the very end of April 1945, and Bormann was all prearranged. Bormann was brought in the underground tunnels and put into a canoe and escorted out to a place called Verben, which was just in the British sector, by canal and by river. And I mean, it does sound extraordinary because remember, this is all occupied by the Russians at the time. They even had a woman in a Russian uniform with them, who every time they were challenged by Russians, or even if they saw Russians nearby, she would say, "We're on a special mission from Marshal Zhukov. If you don't get out of the way, so she was shouting at them in Russian. So the Russians all got out of the way. It's a terrific book because if we can go into this little tangent briefly about Canada, he writes about how he got his cover as an agent. This is John Ainsworth Davis is his real name. His pen name was Christopher Crichton. He was worried about being prosecuted, even though he's got letters from Mountbatten and from Winston Churchill in his book saying, yes, this is what really did happen, endorsing his story. But you can only publish it after we're dead. So that's maybe why he waited quite a while. But he writes about Canada and he writes about Dieppe. So in Dieppe was in August 1942. This was not long after, 8 months after the Russians had entered the war, by which time Stalin was getting really annoyed because he's saying, look, we're doing all the fighting at the moment. The British are sitting there. You're getting a few bombs. Most of the worst of the Blitz is over and you're not doing anything. And the Americans were in the war too at that point. And so Churchill wanted to send a message to Stalin that it's too difficult to invade. We can't do D-Day yet. And so that's, I think, why the Dieppe raid happened in August 1942. It was almost exclusively Canadian soldiers that were sent over to do a shore raid as a sort of test. How are we going to get on? If we turn up on the continent and take over a town for a few hours, and then what they really wanted actually was an Enigma machine, which they knew was in the town. So that was the main objective. But the sub agenda was to test what can we actually achieve. And in that raid, John Ainsworth Davis had been sent previously just a few days before to warn the Nazi high command that the Canadians were coming. So he stood up on the beach. On the cliff top above Dieppe at 3:00 in the morning, waiting for this dawn raid with the SS next to him. And they put piano wire around his neck. And they said to him, if the Canadians or if the troops are not here at Dieppe by 6 a.m., you're going to be kicked over the cliff. And actually what happened was at 6 a.m., or 5 a.m. just before he got kicked over the cliff, this raid arrived at Dieppe. But the Nazi, Wehrmacht and the SS were waiting for the Canadians, and that's why there was such a horrific massacre. But the subtext of this, Matt, is sending a message, isn't it, to Stalin, saying, look, we've tried. It was a terrible disaster. It was a really awful massacre. And the idea is Stalin is thinking, well, okay, so we're just going to have to slog on our own for another good while, because they're doing what they can over there, and the Germans have just got such good defences on the coast. But as I say, so many died. It's 3,500 casualties, 1,000 Canadians killed, and all really Winston Churchill and his mates doing this to stay out of the war, to give themselves an excuse to make sure Stalin stays in and fights for another long period of time. No, that's a diversion in a way, because it's part of the way that John Ainsworth Davis, Christopher Crichton, in this book Op JB, explains he's building his cover up with the Nazi high command. And just to go on through the there is also a lot of questions about the OpJB book. I mean, I was very, because is it true? Is it really true? You know, it's an incredible book. In order to, I wouldn't be sitting here talking about it now if I didn't think it was. And I think in my own mind, and hopefully for the readers, I have stood it up, not only by visiting and meeting his wife, but also by there's a whole chapter in a book by a guy called Milton Schulman. The book's intriguingly entitled Marilyn, Hitler and Me. He was a book reviewer in London for various newspapers, and this is his memoirs published in, I think that's 1998. And he devotes a whole chapter to the battle to get OpJB published. All of the dodgy things that were happening to John Ainsworth Davies, like manuscripts disappearing, publishers being warned off, etc., threatened, all this sort of thing. So, you know, for me, that was the final straw that said, well, look, OK, this is genuine. If some brilliant, one of the best book reviewers on the London scene is going to devote a whole chapter to this adventure of how we finally managed to get OpJB into print in the 1990s, that helped convince me that there was a lot of truth to it. So anyway, after the war, and this is where we come to the Witch's Cauldron bit, there was a sort of 10-year break, and the Bilderberg conferences were started in Oosterbeek and the outskirts of, just outside Arnhem, in the same place where the British were surrounded. And the Hexenkessel, the Witch's Cauldron, that's what the Germans called it. This at the time, they said, "Oh yeah, the British, they're in the Witch's Cauldron over there, bang bang," and they're being killed. So this is what they called the Hexenkessel. And so the Bilderberg conference, in a way, was an in-joke that the Bilderbergers, with the ex-SS chairman, started their conference in the same zone where they had killed the British 10 years before, in order to give themselves an extra few months to squirrel away their ill-gotten gains from the occupation of Europe, the $1 billion or so that they'd managed to turn into ready cash. Obviously, they had a lot of things which weren't just cash, gold, etc. And so that's why I think the Bilderberg conferences were held at the Bilderberg Hotel in the outskirts of Arnhem, because this is the Witch's Cauldron. This is where it all happened 10 years previously. And it's weird to think about those first conferences, because people like the Labour Party leader at the time, Hugh Gaitskell, were there, and they didn't realise it. They were a little bit uncomfortable. There's a photograph of him sitting in the first conference, in fact, next to Pete, and he sort of looks a little bit uncomfortable. Who are these people? You know, well, it turns out several of the Germans attending that first Bilderberg conference were actually war criminals. It's just that it wasn't known at the time. Since it's transpired that one of them, Kessinger, I think he was, I cannot remember both of the names of them. They're in the book, by the way. But the one of them was one of the chief people in Nazi Germany who was requisitioning Jewish property as part of the final solution. Another one was a deputy in Goebbels' propaganda ministry, who all the people that he was feeding information to and associated with were executed at Nuremberg for being editors of propaganda hate newspapers. You know, these anti-Jewish, anti-Slavic Nazi propaganda organs were executed, and this guy was the one who was feeding them. So these are the guys sitting around at the very first Bilderberg conference. This was shared with me, and the evidence of it by Manfred Petrich. Manfred used to be a regular attender at Bilderberg meetings. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. He was the son of a Nazi jet engine designer. He was working, I think he said, for BMW, who were building the very first ever jet engines for the Messerschmitt 262. And he was born over in Argentina, Manfred. And just after the war, and he went through school. His first job was, guess what, a financier in a Swiss bank. So that was the sort of thing that would happen to the sons of ex-Nazis. I've been talking to the Dutch, a lot of the Dutch as well, they, especially the elderly ones, it's so lovely speaking to the people that could actually remember the days of the battle and the days after the battle, the really oldest ones who were just children really when it happened. And they explained how they were one of the first things they saw after the war was finished were these big limos with Germans in driving backwards and forwards to the coast. They seemed to immediately get started on rebuilding their industries of various sorts. And most of the very first jobs that came to people after the war in Holland as well, there were people who had been Nazi collaborators during the war that were starting these businesses. So where was this finance coming from to rebuild Holland and to restart the whole political system, etc. in Holland? Well, it was coming somehow from people associated with the Nazi collaborators that there had been during the war. And it may be these people didn't go to Nuremberg or anything, but all the locals knew, yeah, you were one of the collaborators, weren't you? And after the Arnhem battle, there was a really horrific time for the Dutch. It was what they called the Hunger Winter, and where that whole region where the Dutch had been helping around the Arnhem area, had been helping the British for a few days in September 1944. The Nazis really punished them badly, horrendously, and just starved. Thousands of people were starved. People were just like skeletons. And so there was a big punishment by the Nazis. So I think if we're looking at what's going on today, I mean, for me, this is just a sort of boring old investigation that's, I'm not interested in agendas. I just want to know, where is this story going? And so I'm so grateful to all those various people over the years. One I really ought to mention is Barry Wynne. Barry was in the SAS after the war. He was a filmmaker in London, and he was actually the public relations chief for ABC television back in the 1960s and 70s, when they were producing the Avengers series, and he was doing all the, getting the latest publicity for the Avengers out through the press, which wasn't difficult because it was a terrific program with Honor Blackman, Diana Rigg, etc., making a terrific splash. But he put me on to Colonel Pinto and the Spycatcher book. He said, I met Colonel Pinto, and if you're writing about Arnhem, Tony, this is really important. You better know about this. And so thanks so much to Barry, who died in his 90s over in Cyprus eventually just a few years ago. He helped. Another guy helped me a lot. It was a chap called Dave Barmby, who'd worked for Plessy and Ferranti, British electronics military companies, back in the 1960s, and he was him that put me on to Burris and the rest of them. So it's always, I think, anything like this is a bit of a team effort. But I think I hope what I've done is to fill in a big gap, which is many people after World War II know about the rather dodgy links between the Nazis and the United States. So we all know about Operation Paperclip. Everybody knows about the movement of people like Reinhard Gehlen, straight out of the German intelligence, into the BND, which is the West German intelligence after the war. So the Russians, obviously, the Soviet Union, are thinking, well, hang on, we've still got the exact same people facing us after the war. And people do know about these links in Germany with the Nazis, and also, of course, in the United States with people like Werner von Braun. There's a brilliant guy, Todd Ryder, ex-MIT, who people may want to have a look at, who's put together some incredible presentations about the amount of Nazi expertise which was used in the Manhattan Project, and the fact that the Nazis were actually developing and testing nuclear weapons, but they knew they couldn't use them in the war because they weren't war winning. They weren't, although you could probably destroy London, you still weren't going to win the war with it by late 1944. So they decided it's better to use a nuclear weapon to do deals with. And so that's exactly what they did, of course, with the Manhattan Project. And there's evidence that, in fact, I put a bit of this in the book too, that the submarine, which had a lot of enriched uranium at the end of the Second World War, was heading to Japan. Dönitz had taken over from Hitler, who shot himself. And Dönitz ordered, at the end of the war in Europe, he said, well, look, now the Americans and the British have beaten us. Now this submarine it had two Japanese officers on board, so they were ordered up onto the surface, and then they were shot and I don't know, buried at sea or something. And then the submarine turned around. It wasn't going to Japan anymore, so it headed to the east coast of the United States and delivered things like the fuse mechanisms for Fat Man, the plutonium bomb, which the Germans had already developed. So that's Todd Ryder. And a lot of this is becoming known and getting known about. Todd's work is really meticulous, and I wouldn't want to say 100% he's right, but it's definitely worth a look if people haven't come across it. I think it's called Forgotten Creators, is his book, but these presentations are mind blowing, really. I mean, there's one basic thing with Todd. If you go, there's a film, I think 1970s film called The Heroes of Telemark, all about blowing up a heavy water plant in Norway, how the British and others did that, and the Norwegian resistance. Well, heavy water is no good for an atom bomb. It's a hydrogen bomb. That's what heavy water's useful for. And so the Germans were already developing this stuff. And Churchill knew that on the end of a V2 bomb over London, late 1944, there could possibly be an atom bomb. In fact, they developed long-range flights from Norway with these four-engine bombers that they could reach New York. So there was a danger of putting an atom bomb on New York or London. And there's a book, Most Secret War, by the chief scientific advisor to Winston Churchill, which was a bestseller in the early 1980s, which goes on for pages and pages about how Churchill was tearing his hair up. We're going to get an atom bomb on London. Well, hang on. How did he know that the Germans had already developed something like this? Or was he just a bit worried? Anyway, these are known about. So what my book hopefully has done is start to put together some of the building blocks to understand the British collaboration with the Nazis in the end game of World War II. Because, what we've seen, I think now, is a consolidation of this Fourth Reich, really, around NATO, around royalty, around European royalty. We've seen a complete selling out of the public in Britain. We've got an extremely discontented population. They are only looking for politicians to vote against. There doesn't seem to be anybody representing them. Most of the mass media based in London is biased in one way or another. It's either owned or it's been steered towards a kind of pro-war agenda. Particularly the bias towards Israel. I mean, the obvious thing to do in politics in a country like Britain, number one, is to sever ties with any genocidal states or organisations. The other thing is to start to utilise the Bank of England to fund the things you want to do. But these options, it seems, by all political parties have been blocked off. So we're living in a sort of fake democracy now. And I think that the power of the corporates, the big corporate world, the transnational elite, financial elite, that various people over the years, I think it was called the Power Elite, wasn't it? There was a fantastic book in the 1950s all about who these people are, exactly the sort of people you'll see at a Bilderberg conference. And it seems to me that is exactly where the power lies now. It doesn't lie with the people. So we're not in any kind of democracy. The wars, the financial and economic system, we're having a system really foisted onto us, which is a digital money system, electronic money. More and more places are refusing to accept cash, and everything we're doing is trackable. So this, I think, to me, is a sort of Fourth Reich they're bringing in. And it gets one final thing I'll say is about the sinister aspect of this is the sort of accelerationist, Armageddonist aspect, because many of the things we're seeing are prophesied in things like the Book of Revelation. This idea that you can have a mark of the beast that you can't buy or sell without a mark of the beast. Is this a chip in your hand or your forehead? What it doesn't also imply, of course, is that you've got a kind of overclass, the forehead people, and the hands, the workers. But this is becoming a reality now, that you cannot do what you need to do without being tracked everywhere, CCTV everywhere. All that, well, not everywhere. It's never there when you phone the police and say, I've had my handbag snatched. They say, oh, sorry, can't find the footage, you know. But there is a mass surveillance system out there now, as we know. And as that surveillance system is being integrated with these mass database systems like Palantir, then everything sort of comes back to Bilderberg again, doesn't it? Alex Karp, steering committee. These people, Peter Thiel, steering committee. These people, I think, they do see themselves as gods. In a way, they like to play at God. Let's just use one example. The Iran war is launched just before Purim for the Jewish Israeli believers. And so in a way, what they're doing is they're saying, well, we're going to start a war right now. This is seen as a positive thing by many Israelis. Oh, the attack on Iran. And so the Jewish people in Israel are now thinking, wow, this is fantastic. Look what God is doing. He's starting a war for us at Purim. And so by integrating these sorts of large events around the world with the hearts and minds of the people that they want to influence, they're convincing them that God is helping them, when really it's actually a bunch of Fourth Reichers that are doing this stuff. That's why I think they really do believe. They don't believe in God at all, but what they believe is that they can pretend to be God. There's this whole thing of satanic inversion as well, which is rather horrifying to see when everything is reversed. So the Book of Revelation, they're trying to be the bad guys, but actually they're trying to spin themselves as the good guys. So the Antichrist is the good guy now. So anyway, that's how they seem to manage to try and spin it. The connection, my connection with the father of accelerationism is another weird twist in all of this, because back in the 1970s, I spent several years as good friends with Nazi Nick Land, as he was known at school in southeast London. So he's now known as the father of accelerationism. I was first introduced to his role in the accelerationist movement by David Livingstone, who's another Canadian writer who's written an excellent book. I'm sure you've come across it. That Transhumanism, the history of a dangerous idea. And so these individuals like Nick, I mean, I know Nick very well. In fact, when I see recordings of him, etc., I still can hear his voice from the 1970s. And he always had a very dark sense of humour. It wasn't a popular thing to be a Nazi in our school, but Nick managed to get away with it somehow. And he went on to do. He was a big fan of Nietzsche. When I knew him, we would even do games over Hayes Common, where something called the British Free Army. We were playing at being a mercenary army. We were training, doing things like night operations. Nick was always in charge, but it was great fun when I was 15, 16 years old. But it's interesting to see where he's gone. And he's now been flown over to California just a few weeks ago by the top AI hedge fund manager in Silicon Valley. He's living in Shanghai. But I have approached him to be interviewed. He's not replied, but through some mutual friends, which is a pity, because it would be great to grill him about accelerationism from someone that actually knows him, because this seems to be one of the most pernicious movements on planet Earth. And it was good to see Tucker Carlson interview somebody a few months ago. I think it was tail end of, or maybe no, beginning or tail end of 2025 or beginning of 26, looking into these occult matters. Because I think any honest journalist, if they follow the story to the end, they often find these occultic connections. So I hope I've done something with the book to explain to people, and I don't know if you've got a picture of the book, you'll see many of the protagonists on here. Martin Bormann himself, who it seems now absolutely clear, at least the second half of the war, was working for the British. Churchill clearly involved in all of this, but most importantly through his private secretary, Desmond Morton. Morton was the key mover, as John Ainsworth Davis explains. He's having meetings about going over as a double agent into Germany, and he's chatting with Morton, and he hears a movement behind him. He turns around. Oh, it's the King stood there. So they were working for something called M section of MI6, which was a section of the British Foreign Intelligence Service entirely controlled and funded by the King. by the royal family. So it wasn't really, even though it was part of the Ministry of Defence, it was totally isolated from the Ministry of Defence, working with the king. Uh, Obviously, I mentioned Prince Bernhard, but it's amazing to me that Bernhard and Carrington, both involved in that Arnhem battle, became chairman of the Bilderberg Conference, and Carrington uh, became a Secretary General of NATO too. And many of these NATO chiefs have been connected with this. So, I think if we want to look at what NATO's up to, then you don't have to look too far. They have infiltrated and I think now control most of the political leadership in the NATO countries. And obviously are steering many of the events we now see. If you want to look at Donald Trump, he's not a Bilderberg insider. But it seems to me he's the sort of guy who's up for a bit of fun, and he will do as they want him to do. They can nudge and push him whichever way they please. But I'm a news journalist, so I do a weekly podcast, and we've been talking about the undermining of the British political and particularly legal system in this last week with Defend Our Juries, the first ever prosecution of a barrister by the Department for Justice under David Lammy, Bilderberger, has just been announced last week, and he was one of the people who was defending Palestine Action, and he's being prosecuted, it seems, for saying something that the judge said he specifically couldn't say in court, and he's saying, well, this is the major part of the defence. So this is what's now happening, the corruption of our courts over this Pax Judaica, as it's been called. I prefer calling it Pax Zionica, because I think the Zionist movement has been going since at least the 1880s, and that there is a real attempt to infiltrate much of the Western political system, Western media, in order to bring everybody in line with the genocidal maniacs now in charge in Tel Aviv. So, people can listen to the show, but I've also got other bits, other strings to my bow. But the program is live every Friday, UK time, between 5 and 8. And if people want to catch me there, be great to make contact, because I'm always up for people sending me news stories, interesting bits and pieces that we cover in 3 hours, 3.5 hours, even sometimes. Every week, Matt.
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic show, and I'll make sure that there's a link to the broadcast that people can access when this goes up on YouTube and Rumble and BitChute. And so go to the description box for anybody listening right now, and definitely bookmark that channel, that show. The point you made as well on Trump not being directly a part of Bilderberg, but the influence is felt. I mean, Peter Thiel, for a period, I don't think he's still a steering committee member. But I know that for a period, Peter Thiel did enjoy that position, and we know that Palantir is certainly grown in influence in ways that nobody could have ever imagined, as far as even now controlling the U.S. food supply, even being brought into Canada. Carney has given them a massive contract to manage Canada's military systems, as he's putting on this veneer of being anti-American. But then, you're integrating with Palantir. So really, and then you have Oswald Mosley in England, who has a grandson who has found himself as CEO of the Palantir UK. So yeah, certainly when you put those glasses on, you can sort of see patterns everywhere of this unresolved thing. I know that we promised everybody, and do you want to take a brief little tea intermezzo before we go on with Q&A?
Well, if you want to carry on chatting for a minute, I'll just sip some tea here.
Okay. Well, because my carry on chatting was going to really vector around a question pertaining to specifically the Pinay Circle. And it's not something that I've looked too deeply into, but I've noticed more and more that this grouping seems to have been almost like a bridge between the Maison Rouge meeting and the eventual Bilderberg meeting. And I'm wondering, how does that position into your research and this whole flow of this new fascist international?
Well, okay, so Le Cercle, they call it as well. I mean, I'm not an expert on it, but I keep seeing individuals popping up within the British, usually within the Conservative Party, in key positions. We've just had, I'm not sure if it's, can't remember the guy's name, but he was a disgraced Chancellor of the Exchequer under Boris and Rishi Sunak. he managed to. He's now transitioned over to Nigel Farage's party. He's a former chairman of Le Cercle. So this is it is again it's a fascist international organisation. It's mainly constituted from retired intelligence officers or senior intelligence managers, directors general, this sort of thing. And so people like Richard Dearlove from MI6, there will be, if they're not in Le Cercle, they will know all the people that are in there. So it's a bit like Bilderberg. They're too shy to admit that they're connected with these organisations. And by having a membership list up, that's fine. But can the journalist check it? Is this a real membership list, or is this just a website of the people that you want to think? Because these meetings are not open to any scrutiny. You can't stand outside and take photographs of people going in and out. They're totally secret. And so that's effectively, I think, what Pinay Circle is about. Although it's not, I'm not totally au fait with it. It's clearly a way of people, rather than retiring, what they're doing is they're spending their retirement making sure that none of the dirty deeds that they've been doing come out to the public, and they're covering their backsides and furthering their internationalist fascist agenda.
Thank you. I suspected as much. Bruce, go for it.
Thank you very much. Tony, great info. Nice to meet you. Have you read, or do you remember reading? Because you've probably read more books than me, and I don't remember all the books I've read, but a couple of books by Jim Marrs, particularly The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich.
Well, just to say, you are not in focus, but your background is. Is that on purpose?
Oh, that's just moving around.
It's a bit disconcerting. It's like they're more real than you are.
I can fix it.
You're the fuzzy one.
Look, won't be the first time.
That's better. Jim Marrs, look, he's someone I read bits and pieces of for years. I think one of the most influential. Oh gosh, I'm trying to remember. I read a lot of American writers when I was squatting, particularly back in the noughties, early noughties. I was a squatter and spending days and days, months and months in Bristol, just reading and reading through stuff about technocracy. Rule by Secrecy, I think, was one of them. I'm not sure. Is it Jim Keith? I think. Really,
no,
I really enjoyed that.
That was Jim Marrs, Rule by Secrecy.
It was it? Okay.
Yeah.
I
put that in the chat. I put both of those in the chat, and I wanted to ask you, or mention at least for everybody, because it seems so pertinent, the history of Martin Bormann, which is it's so important to have a true history of how the war ended and what was brought over here, Operation Paperclip, and all those scoundrels. So that's in those books. And also, as you alluded to, some tech that came over for the Manhattan Project. It's in one of Jim Marrs' books where he presents the evidence that we were not going to have atomic bombs ready by 1945. And part of the deal was the uranium that came over, that was shipped here from Nazi Germany, that was enough to have the 3 blasts that summer, the test in July and the 2 over Japan. So I haven't read these books in many years. So I'm gonna get. What's the title of your first book? The first book you guys mentioned about yours, Tony?
Oh, I'm gonna make sure that Tony's books are gonna be linked in the description box. But that's it right there.
The Traitors of Arnhem. Oh, that is on your website. Then it's got a different cover.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. The Traitors.
This is the actual book. Yeah.
All right. Well, I don't know if you want to comment on all that, and then I will have another question. I'm just happy to bring that to everyone's attention. That's that idea of the uranium being brought over that allowed our atomic explosions in the 1945.
Yeah, there's a very good book, Critical Mass, which I think was published 1999, which was one of the first to really put together this evidence the U-boat full of atomic secrets. And it's amazing to think that it was kept so quiet for 55 years. Because they didn't want. It's very embarrassing, isn't it? When the nuclear weapons are dropped on Japan, thank you very much, Germany.
Right, and also it just everywhere. Big brush, Bruce. So much is so phony, the official stories of things, right? But here's my question. I was clicking on your site and I saw the cover. I had a book published by Trine Day, and then I did marketing for Trine Day and Chris Milligan. And the cover of The Siege of Heaven, I thought, by George, that looks like a Trine Day cover. But then on Amazon, it's saying it's out of print, and on your website, you're offering it just as a PDF. I'm so afraid to ask, was there some falling out between you and Chris at Trine Day?
Well, no, Good Chris God. Just decided he didn't want to publish it.
What?
We haven't fallen out. I mean, it's up to him, isn't it? He sent me a cover, and then I said, when's it coming out? And he said, oh, sometime soon. Eventually he said, look, I've just decided I haven't got the money to do it at the moment, and we will have to wait. And so it never got published. But I mean, it was him that encouraged me. With this book, The Traitors of Arnhem, I was actually asked to put together it's Pen and Sword Books up in the north of England. It was Leo Cooper that started that after the war. He was the husband of Jilly Cooper, the novelist. And so I went up to meet the guy that had taken over the company and had a long chat with him. He seemed really happy about it. And then I got a letter from him. No, we're not publishing your book on Arnhem. So this is, it's a recurring theme. I think there's pressure on the publishers. Maybe they're worried about lawsuits. I'm not entirely sure, but we need some real publishers with a bit more spine, I think, in order to get this stuff out there. The internet, I don't think, is enough. I think if you've got something in a book form, it's been properly worked on, properly marketed, properly indexed, etc., it makes a big difference. And there has been a takeover of all media, I think, certainly here in Britain, by people like the Murdoch Empire. HarperCollins have swallowed up. My wife's family were publishers. They were completely swallowed up by a big publishing company, taken over, hostile. Actually, it was a fairly friendly takeover, but they were controlling the market. So they're driving all the small publishers into the ground and one by one picking them off and taking all their titles. So this, I see that as a bit of a Fourth Reich operation, to be honest with you.
Indeed. Thank you. Great to meet you and hear all this today. Thank you.
Monty.
Yes, thank you so very much, Tony. Very close to my heart on this whole subject matter. And I posted a link of Dmitry Medvedev's op-ed on May 7th in RT, which goes into very minute detail insofar as what's coming out of many diplomats in Russia right now, insofar as stating that Germany was never denazified. and then he goes, this is May 7th, right before Victory Day. And it's going out publicly through various Russian ambassadors and diplomats right now. One of the goals in Ukraine was not only the militarization of Ukraine, but the denazification of Ukraine. And now they're saying the quiet part out loud, which they knew all along, that really it's a war against NATO, against Russia. And now they're stating explicitly, and they go through the details of this, of how not only Germany, but NATO was Nazified. I mean, there was the secretaries of generals of NATO since the mid-50s through the 70s were Nazi Wehrmacht and SS officers. So I think this is very significant. I put a link into this of Dmitry Medvedev's full speech. I think it's worth pondering this, because I think they are saying the quiet part out loud right now insofar as the mark of the beast of what we're really facing worldwide, because NATO really is worldwide right now, and that's really the beast that's been lingering, but remaining hidden to most. So your comment on that, please.
Yeah, right. Thanks. Denazification, right? I was very privileged to know before he died, and he was in his 90s. He was actually, at the time, he lived in Marlborough in Wiltshire, a guy called Harry Beckhoff. Harry had written a book called, I'll just try and get the exact title of it up, Germany's Fourth Reich. Origins and Development, Seeking World Domination, Diminishing Britain. So that's one of Harry's books. He did several books. He was absolutely convinced about, because he worked for MI6 during the Second World War in North Africa to begin with, and then it closer to home after the Africa campaigns, and after the war he was sent in to do this exact job, denazification. And Harry, he was the longest serving member of the Conservative Party at the time. I think that was about 10 years ago. And so he was known by the Conservative leaders rather obsequiously, used to go and pat him on the back and things like that, because they were basically ignoring everything he was saying about the European Union. So the EU is a United States of Europe, says Harry, and this is exactly the plan which was being put together in 1941 by various departments, mostly the Nazi finance ministry, as a way of administering occupied Europe. So, for example, we've seen Tony Blair implement the breakaway of Wales and Scotland in the United Kingdom. This is exactly what the Nazis intended to do in 1941. Harry told me a terrific story. In fact, there's still some interviews with him around, I think on Radio 4 All, with Harry, where he explained to me, in fact, he did a whole program one week, 2 hours he did, very amazing, in his 90s, doing a news review. And then we had an hour really chatting with him about some of the stuff that he'd done during the war and after the war. He explained how he found in Cologne the head of the university, and he was a little bit suspicious about this guy. A few people put him onto him, said, look, check this guy out. Turned out he was a full-on SS guy during the war, and he was straight away after the war, literally the late 1940s, running the university. And so Harry, as part of his denazification work for MI6, reported this to the British authorities. Right, this guy needs to be moved out. He's obviously a traitor. Anyway, so the amazing thing that Harry said was that when he put this information through, suddenly there were questions about him in the House of Commons, saying, who is this Harry guy? He's actually now still thinks he's fighting World War II. He's interfering in the rebuilding of Germany. And although the guy did actually eventually get removed, there was quite clearly political pressure being put on within the British parliamentary system for Harry to be lent on for discovering a former top Nazi running a university in the new Germany. So, he was good at his job, a bit like someone like Oreste Pinto as an intelligence officer. The trouble is, intelligence officers these days, I think they realise, look, there are certain little toes we mustn't tread on. Otherwise, we're either going to lose our job, lose our pension, or maybe even get a bullet in the back of the head.
Richard Moore. Richard, if you're still there, you got to take yourself off mute.
I think I finally got it.
Okay, good. There you are.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Tony. I learned a lot of new things. You covered a lot of good ground. I just wanted to offer a characterization of Pax Judaica. I'd say what it is, it's a new kind of imperialism, parasite imperialism, like those little creatures that take over the brain of the host and then make it do things. Anyway, that's what I had to say.
Well, yeah, Zionica really, because look, I think I don't think Netanyahu is Jewish. I don't think Smotrich is Jewish. I don't think Ben Gvir is Jewish. I mean, a lot of these people, particularly the maniacs now in charge, they're just terrorists. They're nihilists, and they will say anything in order to get their way. So this is why this sort of characterizing this Israel as a Jewish state, I think, is just wrong. If you think about who's constituted most of the Jewish population, supposedly, in Israel, well, it's the people who were prepared to go along with, many of them anyway, to go along with the Nazi programs in the late 20s, early 30s to persuade Jews to leave. And these are the ones that were maybe a little bit less close to their faith. I mean, they did an amazing, horrific thing, the Nazis, which was, and Bormann was a big part of all of this, by the way. It was the Wannsee conference. He organised, again, like the Red House meeting, but didn't go himself. And so it's very clear to me that there was an attempt there to basically wipe out the entire faithful rabbinic tradition in the whole of Europe, which they pretty much effectively did. But those who were sort of on the periphery of it and weren't too bothered about, the faith, hopped on and said, right, we'll just get out of here. Well, many people, obviously, many escaped to other parts of Europe and then got away. Many came to the United States, but those that didn't. So the whole character of the rabbinic tradition in Europe was altered by Hitler. It's a very deliberate, I think, deliberate thing, and so it's the Zionist movement, seems to me, that we're dealing with, and they are doing everything they possibly can to link this to being Jewish, to link this to the Ten Commandments, to link this to the sort of temple tradition, as people like Pete Hegseth are. So to me, it's a usurping, it's a synagogue of Satan. That's, to use a phrase from the Book of Revelation. In that it's trying to use the good auspices of Christ or whatever. And if you think about what's going on, 2,000 years ago, Jesus was actually alive. So he was there, whatever, 26 years old. I think he finished his ministry when he was 33. And so what we're seeing now playing out from Jerusalem is an anti-Christ regime. So it seems a little bit rich, since Jesus was Jewish, to call it Jewish. And there's been a lot, I think, of attempts to create that idea of... many of my friends in Bristol, where I live, are Jewish and are absolutely as abhorred as everybody else by seeing what's happening to the Israelis, the genocide, etc. And so, it's a bit of a trick, as Hitler played, to try and categorize. The reason that Nazi Germany started really hating on Jewishness was because of the involvement in the First World War of bringing the United States in. Once 1916. This is my reading of history. I may be wrong, but it seems that in 1916 or 17, the Germans had won the First World War, but the Zionist lobby in the United States, through the newspapers and through their influence in politics, managed to bring the Americans in, the sinking of the Lusitania, obviously, to the war and restart it. And this was really used in the 1920s in order to demonize all Jews. Now, this was just a small group who'd been involved at Versailles, etc. But the idea is let's just make this about all Jews, and so there's been we had the same in the Northern Ireland conflict, in the Troubles, in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, with the attempt to characterise it as a religious battle between Protestants and Catholics. Look, it was a battle between two completely separate groups of people who didn't even, most of them, go to church. They weren't really interested in that, but they were two separate ethnic groups. It was a bunch of settlers that mostly had come from Scotland, the Protestants, and it was the indigenous population who were characterised as Catholics. But really it was a battle between the nationalists and the loyalists. And this isn't a religious thing. This is just a cultural, ethnic thing. And so I think you can see the same sort of thing playing out. So, for example, between Shia and Sunni in the Middle East, seems exactly the same sort of formula, divide and rule formula, has been used to really weaponize these faiths and to put people in charge. It's almost like, CIA gets to choose who's going to be the evangelical pastor in your town, then they're weaponizing this entire faith. And I think that's been going on, for centuries, actually. Look at Constantine taking over, setting up the Roman Catholic Church as a way to control the Christians that the emperors were failing to control. In fact, the more the Roman emperors tried to, like Diocletian, tried to control them, the bigger Christianity was getting bigger and bigger all the time. So, anyway, so that's my take on this Pax Judaica. I don't see it as that at all. It's a Zionist empire that they're trying to create, and the idea is they're going waving around these Jewish flags. Pete Hegseth may not realize it, but they're planning to reinstitute sacrifices at the temple in Jerusalem. This is reversing Christ, so they're saying we're going back to before Christ. Christ is supposed to be the Lamb of God, the final sacrifice. Actually, we're going back before that, so as if there was no Jesus. So has anyone told Pete Hegseth? I'm not quite sure. And anyway, that temple was built by the Hiram of Tyre, and he wasn't Jewish. In fact, the whole thing was built by and designed by, it seems, by people who are much closer to the Canaanite faiths and child sacrifice and that sort of thing than they were to the Jewish faith. So in a way, the temple is a symbol of the failure, Solomon's sort of falling away from the Jewish faith. And anyway, if you go to Revelation again, you'll find that John says in there that there will be no temple in the New Jerusalem. So what are they doing, trying to recreate a temple? Hegseth really needs to do a sort of masterclass in this in order to get his head around it, because he doesn't seem to be quite the Christian he says he is.
Yep, he definitely needs some better lessons in the Bible, that's for sure. Your astute observation on the fact that this smells more of a pre-Christian, even pre-Jewish Canaanite occult religion is very astute. And I think, yeah, when you look at the Old Testament as well, like the amount of times you find throughout the Old Testament demands to stop worshiping Baal and Moloch and stop sacrificing your kids. It's everywhere. It's like 30 different books in the Old Testament. Just like it's a war against Baal and Moloch. And these agencies that have been so obsessed with creating this temple cult, they really do want to get that good old religion back again. Under
if you go into the Old Testament, you keep finding this phrase. When a king dies, I think it's in the Book of Kings, actually, again and again. It's through all the different kings that they've got. And when a king dies, the whoever's writing the book, I'm not quite sure who it was, but is saying, this is the Jewish history basically saying, this king was displeasing to Yahweh. So they were doing worship on the high places and this sort of thing. So there's this sort of, I suppose, peripheral prophecy priesthood, which is keeping an eye on what are our leaders doing? Are they actually keeping to the faith constantly? This really niggled many of the kings. They really hated having these prophets out there, the sort of guys that you'd see in the Monty Python Life of Brian, giving a great speech about some, whatever they thought the prophets were, and then maybe getting stoned for saying the wrong thing. But anyway, there was a very powerful prophecy strain and literary strain running through the Jewish kingdoms. But most of the Jewish kings were displeasing to Yahweh, were encouraging worship on the high places, and so they were falling away. And of course, Solomon was in a way one of the worst, in that he's bringing all these concubines in. He started off really well, but he was a bit of a disaster. And then building the temple, well, I don't know if many Christians understand just how that could be, an attempt really to reverse all of the positive things that Christ brought to the world, and this idea of love your enemy. So that means love Satanists. People might not want to do that, but it means chat to the Satanists, be kind to them, and genuinely love them. And you will find, some of them will potentially come back away from that, because this is what they're trying to encourage: animosity and hatred. And we all know, I think, anybody, even children, understand that doesn't get you anywhere.
Yeah, no, that's a very Christian very Christian attitude you got there, Tony. It's good. It's good because we're I think very jaded and cynical, and we're very quick to believe that good people can be corrupted. It's reinforced in our media and in our culture and our entertainment. Is good people becoming bad? But the idea of bad people becoming humble, going through a crisis, becoming better, that's not so present. It's a very foreign idea, unfortunately, to our current society, which I think partially why people are so incapable of seeing how the good has been able to organize and resist at better times in our past this movement of evil, because it's, good people have had that Christian outlook to try to find the goodness inside of somebody who is wayward and work to try to bring out the better part of them. And that's like all throughout history. And yeah, so I just appreciate you just saying that the way you did. It's very good. JD, I'll jump back to the questions because I don't want to hog you, because I know people are lined up to ask you questions.
I just want to say something really quickly about this, this idea of Jews, actually, many Jews becoming really disillusioned with Israel, moving away from Israel, starting to think, what is this thing that I've been conned into being? I think it was Tim Cohen, who's a writer on the Antichrist, quite an interesting guy, saying Jews are getting to the point where it's time to get out of Dodge. Things are getting too tough, getting too rough. And so this, of course, is, and the way you get around this, if you're really an evildoer, is to create something like AI. So decisions are being made by non-people. You can't find the people to cooperate with your plan. So you've invented these little bots that do it, without thinking, because they're totally inhuman. I remember also meeting, amazing it was to meet him, David Rockefeller, at one of the Bilderberg conferences. One of the photographers pointed out, I think that's Rockefeller. So I walked over. I'd read so much about the Rockefellers, and I was sort of half expecting some kind of nasty. He was a very, very nice, gentle guy. And I remember thinking, yeah, so I kind of thought you might be a bit like this. He wasn't aggressive. He was very kind. But he didn't want to talk about anything to do with the conference. Every question I put to him, he wanted to talk about the lovely fish restaurant that was round the corner, But I think we have to understand these are human beings, and that's, I think, the purpose of Nick Land and his artificial intelligence is the creation of a whole sort of army of bots that will do what human beings would never do in the future.
JD Tippett. JD, go for it.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tony. That was really a great presentation. I thought, especially off of the last comments of Matt.
JD, your voice is not coming through too clearly. Could you speak somehow directly?
Can you hear me?
That's better. Yeah.
Is that better? Okay. Yeah, I was just going to say, especially off the tail end of what Matt just talked about the potential goodness, because it does seem like, as you mentioned, this Pax Zionica, or what, maybe Pax Americana, just the kind of thing that we're seeing where we're looking at a general range of passive compliance to full-blown subjugation, where we're seeing a cessation of our freedom. Yeah. And, potentially, maybe the idea that we're a conquered nation or conquered nations, the West.
Yeah.
You guys had a good presentation a few days ago about the war on the West. And so, when I think about all that, and I think, are we really in a place where we can no longer fight back against empire? Have we crossed over in some way? I mean, I look to maybe the last 125 years. I kind of call the when the Rhodes Trust kind of came out, that's maybe was the coup de grace from all of the things that happened in the late 19th century, from the assassination of Lincoln and all the assassinations that happened to the end there, and all of a sudden, we cross over into this little over a century of cessation of freedom, where we're just seeing where everything that we try to do as a sovereign individual is getting the top down pressure, on us, and the inability to pursue freedom and things like that, in that way. Do you see us moving away from, are we going to see a restoration of justice? Or are we going to see something genuine? Are we going to maybe see some harmony come back into play here, of harmony of our interests, just in a general way?
Well, I mean, look, I think it's going to be rough. I think it's going to get really rough. United States, you're right. I think it's owned. Britain is owned. I mean, so just as a really simple example, we've got these bombers that have been taking off from Gloucestershire, just down the road from me here, and they're bombing Iran now. The opening of the Iran war, Purim time, we had the British Prime Minister saying the Americans were not going to be allowed to use any British bases. But suddenly the Americans just did, because what are you going to do? You're going to send the SAS into our US Air Force base in Gloucestershire? So there is just this is just the law of the jungle we're seeing, and who is actually calling the shots? I think that we're looking at ultimately the World War III will be between China and the United States mainly. I mean, potentially the big sort of kicking off point will be the Middle East, but you're dealing with. I mean, Trump is just about to go to China, and what we've seen is the Iran war calm down, just so we've got a bit of space for Trump to talk to President Xi. Otherwise, you might just say, "Well, no, I'm not having you here." You've stopped all our oil, so why should I? And so the geopolitics of it isn't really making sense anymore. There's no rationality to it. In terms of anything positive to say about it all, is I think we don't know where it's all going. I look here in the UK and I see, well, yes, the Americans are quite oppressive in certain places at the very tops of elite institutions. They're becoming dominated by finance. But I also see an enormous amount of raising of awareness of youngsters, of particularly this amazing actions that have been taking place in central London week after week after week in support of the Palestinians, in the opposition to the genocide, and also the pensioners coming out with these "I support Palestine action" placards, "I oppose genocide." Being thousands of them being arrested, and but queues and queues of more people wishing to get arrested, and the police just running out of space. So there is a most definite, I think, raising of awareness and understanding about in a way, what's happening is the empire is sort of painting itself into a corner. Quite how that resolves itself, I'm not sure, but. I mean, I used to play war games with Nick, right? This is the things like SPI, Avalon Hill. We played the Sinai battles, the 6-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, this sort of thing, on these tabletop with little counters. When I was 15, that's how sad I was. But I really enjoyed it, actually, and he was good, and occasionally I beat him. I mean, he's a game theory guy, basically. And I see now that war evolving into this eventual clash between the US controlled. I mean, you could just say the Freemasons control the United States. I mean, certainly that was the plan of the British once they lost the War of Independence, to just install Masonry to run the colony as a sort of fake democracy. And the British were supposed to be, or the occult British were supposed to be in charge. But then, of course, you've got the similar thing going on with the Chinese Communist Party over in China. You've got I mean, whether they're triads at a lower level, but it's secret societies, I think, in control of both of these big superpowers. The one exception to all of this, of course, is the Orthodox Russians. We've just seen the victory parade from 1945 just the other day in Red Square in Moscow. The Russians are talking, it seems to me, a lot of sense about Ukraine and about the Middle East. They're not trying to build an empire. They pulled out of Syria, etc., pulled out of the Eastern Mediterranean. They're still seeing the Black Sea as part of their territory. So Russia is, and their allied nations like Belarus, etc., they seem to be the sensible guys in the room. And I can tell you, the games we played back in those days, you can look at what's happening. And this is why I think the British and the royal family here, Charles particularly, dislikes Putin. He likened him to Hitler famously. So much is because they are the ones who will clear up after the war. The Russians are obviously a nuclear power. You don't mess with these people. Otherwise, they're just going to wipe you out. And so, as the Americans and the Russians, he's put a massive spanner in the works for World War III, has Putin. And if you look at how he came to power in 2000, it was fascinating. He was very pally with Berezovsky, who was the top oligarch who was put in charge of Russia. He owned NTV, the first private TV station in the newly liberated. They had a horrendous economic crisis with quite a lot of people were starving, apart from the fact they had dachas to go to where they could grow food, which we don't have generally in the rest of the West. But so in that era, Putin managed to convince Berezovsky that he was going to be his man. You know, he knew about the apartment bombings in '99, so he took over from Yeltsin. Berezovsky thought he was doing the right thing. He had someone that he had by the short and curlies as a president. But the first thing Putin did was he spoke to the chief prosecutor. He said, "What have you got on Berezovsky?" And so within a very short period of time, Putin was able to phone Berezovsky up and say, "Look, I haven't been able to stop the prosecution. They're doing you for the Aeroflot flotation, which was totally fraudulent, and I'm trying to stop the prosecution. I'm going to show my hand too much if I do it, but I advise you, can you please just get out of the country for a few weeks, and I'll turn off the heat on you." And that was, I think, on a Friday. Berezovsky flew out at the weekend, and that was it, because Putin had got the top oligarch out of the country. It sent a message to all the other oligarchs, Khodorkovsky, the rest of them, that if you mess with the Kremlin, you're going to end up either in jail or you're going to be booted out of your country. You're going to have your assets seized. So Putin made it absolutely clear to all of these oligarchs that he was in charge, and you could do what you want, do your drugs, whatever, sell your shares, take over companies, but if you start stepping on the toes of the Kremlin, right, you're out. So don't even think about it. And so in a way, he became the sort of top oligarch in the country, only he was the president. I think he was able to do this really because of his Siloviki. He was, sort of FSB guy, KGB guy in the run-up to all of this. And so he turned the tables on Berezovsky, who came to a bit of a sticky end in London. So that's the way I see things playing out, with the Russians being the sort of sensible guys in the room generally at the United Nations, etc., and possibly being able to sweep up after a Third World War.
Is it a pipe dream maybe that we would imagine a real peace coming between Russia and China and the United States ever, or in this let's call interregnum, if we will?
Well, look, I think, to be quite frank, I think lots of people are going to be caught up in this, whether it's an economic disease, whether it's warfare. However, it's difficult to see it not, wiping millions of us out. But ultimately, they're on a hiding to nothing, as far as I can see. So long as there are still some reasonably sensible people and human beings basically in the system that are not bots or AI making decisions over life and death and over what we see and hear. So, I mean, in my own profession in journalism, we've had a massive move into the profession by AI. Things like much sports news stories, you've even got whole magazines now being written by AI with fake bylines on the stories. And what's happened over the years? So everything's been being dumbed down since when I was working in the late 80s, early 90s in mainstream journalism, in broadcasting as a reporter and as a researcher. The dumbing down has led to this situation now where you could replace politicians' speeches with AI. You could replace politicians with AI. You could replace journalists with AI, and no one would notice, because it's become so anodyne, so wooden, so bland, And this is all AI can produce. It's not artificial intelligence at all, really. It's not an intelligence. It's just a form of plagiarism and a form of copying what someone else is doing. There's no original thought, no original thinking really involved. In fact, I've tried AI on some books, particularly some of the books what I've mentioned today, and it never can get to the really interesting nub of what is actually in that book. What it does is a superficial pond skater, I call it, skimming over the surface. But people have become almost used to this now, and particularly young people. They don't see, except on social media, etc. They don't see anything else. And so I think if there were, I see that one of the most hopeful things is in independent media, and I know there's a lot of it out there. I mean, I'm talking about things like Dialogue Works, and there's all sorts of programs. Scott Ritter has done an amazing job, I think, in taking PX to pieces, really. And there are all sorts of characters who've done a great. Judge Knapp's show, I think, is just one of the greatest things in the English language at the moment. But of course, none of the people who appear on these programs will ever appear on the BBC. It's really upsetting to see. And so we have a go at doing a similar sort of thing on a obviously much smaller scale, just a Bristol perspective on what's going on in Britain and around the world, even with a few local stories too. We do local stuff. Independent media and journalism is there. So, I would just encourage anybody, stop moaning about the press. Isn't there a song? Don't hate the media. Become the media. I seem to remember from one of these like 1980s pop songs somewhere. I don't know, was it? Someone I'm sure will know who that was. But anyway, that's the message. I think is rather than curse the darkness, light a lamp somewhere.
Yeah, that's a very useful little beacon to hold on to as far as a Tao, a principle of just operating in life in general. Uwe has done incredibly interesting historical research on a lot of the topics that you've covered, and he did miss a little bit, but he asked me, is his question relevant based on what you just went through in your lecture? And I said, absolutely, it's relevant. Yes. So Uwe, go for it.
Yeah, thank you. And apologies, Tony, for missing most of your talk due to a personal situation over here. So I'm from Germany, and as Matt said, I have a history degree, but I have not learned any of what you were going about in your books at university. I only come to study this when I started to work with a Holocaust survivor during the COVID era, who, as a Holocaust survivor, was claiming that this could be the beginning of the Fourth Reich. Her name is Vera Sharaf, and I worked with Vera Vera Sharaf on a film and book project. And in the process of this, I wrote two pieces which were deeply what's the word in English? I was deeply obliged for your work. I drew heavily upon your Arnhem book and others. So the question I have is, we in Germany, we have been taught after the war that Adenauer was the decent guy who was forced into exile by the Nazis for his staunch anti-fascist stance. My research, which was not originally my research, but I combined a fair number of publications to put it together. In these publications I mentioned, even around the issue of Operation Market Garden and what followed, is Adenauer being a in-law to John McCloy via his wife's family. Sincer, one of her ancestors, or I think even her father, was president of the University of Cologne before 1945. You mentioned the the president of the university at 1945. This was not her father, but he was president in the Weimar Republic. So could you speak to this whole situation pertaining to the rebuild of Germany? Unfortunately, I missed your explanations about Bormann. I'm going to revisit that in the recording, but the situation in Germany, I've just briefly, a second piece which I wrote was about the connections between Hjalmar Schacht and Norman Montague Norman, whose godson became the plenipotentiary of the Treuhandgesellschaft, who sold off East Germany. So this was Norman von Scherpenberg, who was Montague Norman's godson. So this shows very broadly that the connections went on very, very, very long into the present or most recent past. I would like to hear your take on or your research on this particular German aspect of continuation of Nazis post 1945 in so-called democratic Germany.
Wow. Well, look, I interviewed somebody, and I can't remember the guy's name. This is a few months ago, whose father had been instrumental in the merging of East and West Germany behind the scenes. It was clear that there was all sorts going on connected with the Trilateral Commission to arrange that for the fall of the Berlin Wall. So this was all kind of stage managed. Now, that isn't necessarily a dodgy conspiracy of some sort. It may be that after, well, I mean, the thing is, maybe I'm just talking nonsense, and maybe it is a conspiracy of some sort, because it was before the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was one of the first things that happened, wasn't it? 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and then the whole Soviet Union thing started to fall apart. And so, there clearly has been action behind the scenes to make these things happen. But to be quite frank with you, I just don't know enough. There is a bit in the book about some of the German Nazis, and I'm not talking about just ordinary soldiers. I'm talking about serious war criminals involved in the first Bilderberg meetings. Mm-hmm. Not least of which is a spy called Prince Bernhard, who was chairing the meeting, who probably should have been executed during the war. So I can't really. I mean, I would love to read your stuff. I've not seen it, so please do send it to me. I mean, it just sounds to me like a very important treasure trove of information. Right. I've also found, I think that's the LaRouche people in Germany quite good. I've interviewed them from time to time. And so the LaRouche organization, to me, as a Brit, I quite like to have some people like them around who are being very critical of the British. In a way, they sort of spurned me on to look into this British Nazi connection and to join the dots between Winston Churchill's private secretary and Adolf Hitler's private secretary. So this shocked me when I started delving into it. But quite clearly, there is a very powerful ruling class that's been around, an aristocracy, I suppose, for many, many years in Europe that really does think it runs the show, and it entertains itself by having this sort of patina of democracy. So I'm sorry I can't really answer what you're saying, but and I also can't even remember. If you give me a few seconds, I might dig the guy's name out actually, who I recently interviewed about his father's secret role in the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the connection with the Bilderbergers.
Right. So I've posted the links in this chat, but I will also be happy to send it over to you via Matt.
Yeah, thanks.
Cool. Yeah, I'm going to make sure you guys have each other's contact info as well.
Yeah, do that. Yeah, thanks, Matt.
Communication going. Yeah, I think that'd be fruitful. So Marilyn got in with a question, and this might be the last question, maybe. What do I got here? There might be one more after Marilyn, but Marilyn, go for it.
Sure, Tony, thank you so much. Fascinating presentation. I learned so much. I really, really appreciate it. I just wanted to ask if you could explain a little bit more about, you mentioned secret societies in China and the role that they play in having any control over the Chinese government. And then Matthew, if you could also address that point as well, I'd appreciate it.
Matt, I'll let you go first.
Okay, Marilyn, the sound for whatever reason glitched a little bit on my side. Could you just repeat the first part, or just repeat the question quickly?
Sure. Yeah. First, much praise to Tony for his presentation. This is about the Tony mentioned secret societies in China having some role in having control over the government there. As a corollary to secret societies in the United States. So I just wanted to get a little more clarification about that.
Okay. Yeah, we're going to be putting together an actual documentary, Cynthia and I, very, very shortly that'll deal with a big chunk of this story. And also it'll tackle it from the standpoint of dissecting the architecture of the deep state structures, their origins and influence inside of China. Like where are the Davos influencers, the Soros influencers, these secret society networks, which are pretty well mapped out. The thing that's noteworthy about the triads is that they had to survive the purges. They got illegalized in 1949, and they were given sanctuary in Hong Kong when the British were running it. And so Hong Kong became the base, as well as Taiwan, of the triads by and large, as well as Macau under Portuguese control. It happened again under Deng Xiaoping. He also legalized secret society. So they were legalized and purged in two wars, 49. And then in 56, it happened again. And then in 77 or so, there was another takedown. But again, the British were always very happy to help provide as much support and sanctuary to these networks, which were then able to be used as pseudo-Chinese, sort of like Chinese on the surface appearance, but not really in heart, to penetrate back into China. So if you look at like the growth of the Shanghai clique of billionaires, that's sort of since the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank of Commerce days, when it was still a stronghold of the British, it was and still has remained to be a big problematic zone of traitors, which also speaks to maybe why Nick Land chose Shanghai of all places to go in China. It makes me have to just think about that. But when you look at like all of the George Soros networks in the 70s and the 80s that were coming into China, it was through Shanghai and Hong Kong, and they even took control of the government. One of the key patrons or students that Cynthia is going to go through in her video of Zhao Ziyang, who is the Soros operative who became Secretary General and tried to do the coup d'etat in 89. He had a student, a disciple, who became the governor of the Bank of China in 2015, 16, 17. He was fired from that position, but still, it just shows you the immense amount of influence that this clique has. That and I think he, to this day, Cynthia was telling me that he still runs the Davos in China. So there's that. Yeah.
Could I just jump in? That's really helpful, Matthew. What I'm confused about is what Tony was saying. It seemed to me was that the ultimate conflict, World War III conflict, would be between the U.S. and China. And I thought he was implying that it would be conflict between the secret societies of the U.S. and the secret societies of China. But from what you're saying, those two sets of secret societies have been in cahoots with each other. So where's the conflict?
Oh, I think that there's a certain degree of territorial. I mean, Tony might want to chime in on this. I think that there's a certain there's a long discussion you're bringing up, by the way. I don't think the collusion is 100% in the sense that I think that the most dark forces in the bowels of the Asian secret societies, I think they would like to have their particular civilization that they emerged out of and wish to control, and they're willing to sacrifice a big chunk of it as the dominant gods. I think there's a fight over who's going to be the dominant gods. But I think that there's been an authentic Renaissance sort of dynamic from the Confucian tradition, which has tended to organize just in the same way that the best within the Christian West has tended to organize around these principles, which are very similar. Love thy neighbor, an eye for the eye, an eye makes the world go blind. Like a lot of these principles are found within Christian and Confucian teachings. And these traditions are artistic, they're scientific, and they create movements of healthy patriotism that helps people at different moments to have a moral and intellectual bearing on how to fight this beast. So I think that they've done a pretty impressive job compared to how shitty of a job we've done at maintaining that better tradition that JFK and Martin Luther King and others died for. But I don't know, Tony, if you want to add to that.
Okay, so look, the way these secret societies operate is they're not in conflict. They just pretend to be. I mean, look at what happened in the run-up to the Second World War. The British had been with the Americans, had been funding Hitler. They were very friendly with the steel companies that were funding the Nazi Party, the Theosophists that were creating this whole mythos around the German master race and German history. And they're on both sides. They create...
what Marilyn is asking about those is the Chinese triads, which were...
Well, I'm comparing World War II to World War III. So they're on both sides of the game. I mean, there are enormous numbers of people who are obviously somewhere in the middle of the pyramid of understanding. The people down the middle here, they don't know what the people at the top are up to. So the people in the middle are the ones who are actually the people that you may be making decisions about what happens with the Chinese war machine during the war. No, it's a setup. The whole thing is a bit of a setup. I would just also remind. I mean, I travelled to Singapore a few years ago, and I mean, it was a fantastic education going around the city, chatting with people. And as far as I know, it's one of the only police forces in the world that has an entire floor of their version of Scotland Yard devoted to secret societies. So they have a whole unit in Singapore, which is detectives and police investigating, arresting, banging up, prosecuting members of secret societies, because they had a big problem there over the years. I'm not sure, it may be a little bit in the remnants of it in Hong Kong too, because obviously they had. But anyway, so this seems to me to be the point of secret societies, is to build up wars, build up massive empires to then fight each other, the purpose of which you have to think, what is the purpose? Well, the purpose is to create chaos. These are the lords of chaos. The more chaos they can create, the better. And if they can use AI to create even more chaos, or someone like Donald Trump to come out with all sorts of chaotic statements that bear no relation to reality, this is all the better for them. And out of the chaos, they will bring their religion. They will use it to demonize the things like the Jewish faith, the Christian faith, the Islamic faith, whatever. They will use this chaos to do it, and then they will, I think, use this to bring out after all of this turmoil. They'll say, well, we've got to get rid of these silly Judeo-Christian religions that have caused so much trouble. So that, I think, is their ultimate game. And then they will be the gods walking earth. Let's see. I mean, I don't honestly know if that's the case, but don't assume that there aren't people connecting the United States and China at the very top level. I'm sure there are. Look at, for example, they were sharing satellite intelligence. The Americans were sharing satellite intelligence with the Chinese government over various, when there was unrest in one of their provinces. I'm sure there is an enormous amount. I think it was Anthony Sutton did a massive amount of work on secret deals being done right in the middle of the Cold War between big American industrialists that was sneaked through and the Russian war machine in the middle of the Cold War.
Well, Anthony Sutton very high level too, man. Like Anthony Sutton is a big chaos agent himself. He was like boyfriend with Elizabeth Clare Prophet of the temple, this Theosophical temple channeling Archangel Michael. Like he was tight with her church for a long time, and an Austrian school ideologue. So he's looking at everything with an idea of becoming he's not an honest broker of his.
Well, he did. He blew apart. Listen, who is? He blew apart the Skull and Bones. He really did. It's a fantastic job on them.
Well, I'm saying he's a theosophical disciple of the Elizabeth Clare Prophet and
maybe
Austrian school ideologue.
Maybe that's the only way he got into that.
Yeah, but he thought Hitler was.
Maybe that's the only way he could get into those circles. You know, who knows? I know a guy, David Southwell, wrote some fantastic stuff. Secrets and Lies is one of his books, and the history of organised crime in the UK. David has become a Freemason. He said, look, this is the only way to get the research, to get in and find out what's going on. Now, I've no idea whether he's lost his soul in there, but, you know, he saw this as a way to research, to get the truth out.
David should have had a better method of thinking.
Well, maybe, you know, but look, it takes all sorts, Matt. It takes all sorts. And I think everybody's got a little germ of goodness. Maybe not Aldous Huxley, but a lot of people do.
Yeah. Sure. Okay. Here, do you have time for one or two more questions?
Yep, go for it.
All right. So Vegan, you got to ask the question more specifically. You can't just say, can you bring up those scans from Chicago University at an appropriate time? Can you put it up? Vegan is somebody who's done some good work scanning a bunch of Bilderberg documents from the University of Chicago. It's a big repository. But Vegan, do you have a question? I don't know how you'd like me to bring that up.
So yeah. So
thank you.
My question was if anybody else is aware of it and if anybody else has more access to those archives or somebody around the area that could go and see if they're still there or if they disappeared.
Okay. Because these are things you've seen with your own eyes and you took photographs of them, right?
No. I got this from my brother, and obviously they got taken down, and there are some people that obviously have copies of these, and I forwarded them to you because of the community that we're in, hoping that somebody else also has them or has some leads onto them.
Yeah. Okay, what I'll do, what I can do is, that it's good that you've reminded me of those. I could share that dossier with Tony and with Uwe and anybody else who would like to know about this massive bounty of scans that Vegan had come up with. Send me an email and I'll share them around. Let me just see here. Gerald and Madeline had a question, and then I think that would be the last question. So let's end it with Gerald and Madeline. Go for it, Jerry and or Madeline. Are you guys there still?
Yeah, I'm here. Okay. I just got to the computer. Okay. The and or. So my question was, if you had a comment or if you can tell, I was very curious at who brought this thing about King Charles coming to visit the U.S. Congress, which was for me a big shock that they would allow him to speak to the Congress, thinking of the history of the two countries, and also being, I think, an anniversary of the United States, which I think is just the completely wrong celebration, the wrong aspect of bringing King Charles in there this year. So anyway, if you had something to say about that, that would be good. And the special relationship that we are supposed to have, or the U.S. supposed to have with Great Britain. What? Mute.
Tony, it's all yours. Oh, wait a minute. Is Tony still there? Did we just lose Tony? Oh, no. We lost Tony. All right. Maybe his computer battery died or something. It happens. Sorry, Magdalena. You're going to have to live unsatisfied with that one floating around. Oh, there he is. Getting back in there. Let's see how much of that he heard. All right. There he is again. All right. Tony, welcome back in. I'm guessing your computer battery might have died or something.
Exactly. What's happened is it wasn't quite properly plugged in, so it's and it's getting all these warning notices and ignoring them like a fool.
It happens to me all the time. I know what you mean. Were you able to
So
hear the
yeah, I did
thrust of
hear the
Maggie?
question. I just wanted to just add Norbert Hammes is the guy who I interviewed recently about the reunification of Germany, Norberthammas. And his father, who was very much involved in behind the scenes. I mean, he was one of the people the Bilderberger types loved to recruit. So he was a kind of ordinary guy who managed to get into the chemical industries after the plastics and stuff after the war. But he was kind of, obsequious. In other words, he wanted to be part of the big gangs of big industrialists, etc. And so they realized that they could sort of weaponize him to do almost anything, and they did. So he was the guy working behind the scenes with the both sides in the Cold War to, basically stage manage the reunification of Germany. And his father's name was Wilhelm Gustav Hammes. That's Wilhelm, Wilhelm, Gustav with an F, Gustaf, Hammas. And he was a fascinating guest. But on to Charles. Well, what I was annoyed about was that Charles went there at all. He shouldn't have gone. What he's doing is he's doing a nice PR job for Donald Trump. He's endorsing the war. So Donald Trump revealed, didn't he, that King Charles had told him in his little private meeting, in total break of protocol, which is what you expect. You expect from Trump and you hope from Trump. In fact, this is one of the great things about him, that he does totally breach protocol. He explained that Charles had told him that he agreed with his war aim of stopping any enrichment of uranium by the Iranians, even though they're still keeping within the limits of the non-proliferation treaty. They're not up to weapons grade uranium, but Charles agrees with Donald Trump that the Iranians have to be stopped. Now, that isn't official British policy. And what I see in the UK is an increasing assertion of power by Charles and by Camilla. Actually, there was an article in the Times not long after the coronation, which was entitled "Camilla Wears the Trousers," and what I was amused by was that 2 weeks later it had disappeared completely off the Times website. It had disappeared off of the search engines, and I'm like, did I read that article? And yeah, of course I found a copy of it somewhere I'd kept. But this is the way things can easily work, can't they? That Charles is sort of put out there. It's a little bit like. I mean, I think America is going to be expendable in terms of support of Israel. So the Israelis aren't stupid. They realize that the United States is potentially going to cut off the billions that go to the Israelis. And after what they've done and what they're doing, that there is potentially some kind of democratic thing going to kick in, and the Americans will get disillusioned with it. Although they are very much in control at the moment, that may not carry on into the future. They've already got Modi in India ready to take over if the Americans pull the plug. Modi is extremely supportive of the Israelis. They've got very, very close behind the scenes relationships going on. So the Israelis don't really care if America pulls the plug. They'll make a massive fuss about it, of course, but they have contingencies for that sort of thing. But with Charles, I think you've got I mean, what we're seeing, I mean, even just like within the last few days, our Prime Minister Starmer has announced the recycling of two former Labour cabinet ministers back into the government. In fact, a Prime Minister. So Gordon Brown is now moving back into Downing Street as a special advisor to the Prime Minister. The guy that destroyed the economy back in 2008, it was the Prime Minister that took over after Tony Blair. And in fact, he said in the House of Commons, "I saved the world," by mistake. And there was about a 10-minute guffawing from all the MPs. "You saved the world. What are you talking about?" Anyway, so him and Harriet Harman, who was a supporter of the paedophile information exchange, she's also been brought back in. But it's not. This is all since Charles has taken over. So these failed politicians are now being recycled back into Downing Street. That's Starmer's answer to his total failure in the elections this week in Wales and in England. He's completely it's totally tanked the Labour Party. Farage and Reform have stolen over half of their support. But anyway, the point is, it didn't. Do you remember when Cameron? I don't know how much you know about British politics, but David Cameron, the failed politician, was brought in under Rishi Sunak as Foreign Secretary. We've now got Ed Miliband, the failed Labour leader, has been brought in. So what we're getting is we're getting the cabinet and Downing Street stuffed full of utter failures, but all people who are friendly with Charles, that Charles likes. So when Cameron was made Foreign Secretary, I mean, everyone was like, "What, Cameron?" Because he's in the House of Lords, they can just put him in as Foreign Secretary. What happened was there was a ceremony at the Cenotaph, Remembrance Day, 11th of November, the Sunday nearest, and they all trooped out, all these prime ministers, with Cameron and King Charles and Rishi Sunak, who's the prime minister then, all into the Foreign Office to have a big lunch at the end of the show. And the next day it's announced Cameron is going to be Foreign Secretary. So I think the King is running the show, to be quite frank with you. I don't think that there's very much influence by the elected politicians anymore. He also promotes the army officers. He makes them field marshals, colonels, or whatever. That's Charles that signs all that off. He signs off the judges. He signs off the ministers. The way the British Constitution works, it really depends on the character of the King or the Queen as to how involved they get. Elizabeth was very much hands-off. She'd only really get involved in politics if there was some sort of crisis or other. And if we go back to the 1930s, remember that Edward VIII fellow? I think we're dealing with another guy that wants to rule the roost. He sees himself as the sort of saviour of the planet, godlike saviour. He's even had a statue of himself with these giant wings made over in Brazil, a massive statue of Charles, and it says at the bottom, "Saviour of the world." Right? So this is the attitude of Charles, is he sees himself, I'm going to save everybody through the climate crisis, blah, blah, blah. But there he is over in the United States, just simply whispering to Trump, yeah, those Iranians, they're drove. And of course, he's trying to play both sides. He's got some honorary degree in Islamic studies. He's also very friendly with the Board of Deputies of British Jews, which is this right-wing Tory Jewish organisation in London. So he's trying to play both sides of this. I'm looking at him as a sort of Antichrist type figure. So if there is a war kicks off in the Middle East or wherever else, Charles is in a perfect position to come along afterwards and say, "Hey guys, look, we got to bang heads together. Let's make peace." But he's quietly behind the scenes with Donald Trump ratting on him, saying that he's encouraging the war in the first place. Now that to me is is the sort of typical attitude of the elite that Matt talks about. This kind of these bunch of people who are invulnerable to the law and think of themselves as God. That's Charles, all right.
I was always disturbed by the decision to dress Kate in the outfit of Rose from Rosemary's Baby when the Antichrist was revealed back when I think it was her second kid that she unveiled to the world. Of all the things that you could dress her in, that specific outfit is what you chose when the woman in the Roman Polanski movie is like, holding her red roses. That was.
But when I say Camilla wears the trousers, I think a lot of this is being stage managed by people around them. They're not necessarily in on the joke. They're not necessarily in on the game. They may be, they may not be. That's the guessing. I mean, it was also. I mean, it's like with the COVID jabs. Both the Duke of Edinburgh and the Queen died very soon after they'd had their jabs. And then when we had Charles and Camilla very publicly doing the same, having jabs. But were they placebos or not? Who knows? We know full well, anyone that bothers to research into, there's a particularly brilliant book by John Morgan, which is How They Murdered Princess Diana, which is looking at the role that the royal family played in the murder of Diana and the killing in Paris, because she was getting particularly problematic. She was just shacking up with, about to announce the engagement to a Muslim. Imagine that. You've got Muslim half brothers and sisters or whatever of of Harry and William, this could be problematic. I mean, she was also making a big splash on the scene against landmines. There were lots of reasons why the British establishment was starting to get very annoyed. And she was an insider in the firm who had become an outsider. She was incredibly popular in this country. Everywhere Diana went, there were crowds cheering. They loved her. And Charles didn't like, he was being eclipsed by Diana, even whilst they were still married. The crowds all were there to see her, not him. And then, of course, once they split, you had an enormous problem. You've got someone who's been on the inside of the royal family, who's sitting there on the TV giving speeches around the world, around the country, and so I would simply call him wife murdering Wef King. Maybe Charles III at the end of it all, but that's what his persona is, I think, and he's one of the worst we've had. I don't think it's an exaggeration to potentially compare him to Edward VIII.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's definitely a smell of fascism and sulfur about the guy. So yeah. All right. Well, this has been an intense presentation, Tony. Thank you very much for going through all of this. I hope that this inspires people to want to go and pick up your book. Like I said, I'm gonna make this thing available. The link to both your Bilderberg site, which has links to this book and other works that you've done, and this book directly will be in the description box under this video when it does go up, which will be in the next few days. So check that stuff out. Follow Tony's radio show again. We'll include a link down below in the description box there too. And I hope to continue this flow of investigation in the weeks ahead. This has been very, very edifying and very useful. Thank you so much for everybody for joining us. And thank you, Tony, for coming on and sharing your knowledge.
Thank you, Matt, for inviting me. It's very kind of you. God bless everyone.
God bless.